Good afternoon and welcome to the end of the Roman Republic. This is the fourth or fifth video in our series of videos about the history of Rome. And today we are discussing the question of what happened after the Punic Wars to Rome, that she went from becoming this powerful ruler of the known world and the power to deal with, having conquered Carthage, having conquered Greece, having conquered and taken the colonies along the European coast and subdued most of her enemies, to a kind of nation, an empire, or the beginnings of an empire, a republic, that was torn by internal strife. And to understand what was going on, we have to think about the effects of the Punic Wars. And we have to think about the history of Rome and what had been historic sort of conflicts that were built into Roman society. And we have to think about the patricians and the plebeians. Because at the end of the Punic Wars, one of the things that had happened was that once again, land ownership had been consolidated down into the hands of a relatively few people. According to Roman census, there were about 400,000 citizens at that point, and only about 2,000 of them were landowners. And since land ownership was a big piece of what gave people power, what gave them the right to be in the Senate, what gave them the right to be judges and magistrates and so on, that was a very small number to hold so much power. And the gap between the rich and the poor was continually widening. In addition, within Roman society, they had introduced this concept of gladiatorial games. They had introduced this idea that, well, if you were a citizen of Rome, you got a daily or weekly dole of corn. So there was some value in being a citizen, but people were trying to become citizens who did not understand or share the history of Roman culture. And so you start to have a breakdown in society. And you start to have people who are vying for power because they want power. And you have some people who are trying to figure out how to even things back out. One of the groups that was trying to figure out how to even things back out was the Gracchi. And in particular, Tiberius Gracchi, who had been a successful general in Spain, and who, on his return from Spain, saw the great difficulties that the plebeians were having and that the poor were having, and decided to try and get the Licinian Law, which was on the books, but unenforced, reinstated. Now, one of the things that has happened, if you remember, the way that Roman government worked is that if there was a time of crisis, the Senate had the ability to pick somebody and say, you are the dictator until this time of crisis is ended, and whatever you say is law. And the problem is that if you set aside the rule of law and then try and bring it back, it doesn't always come back smoothly or completely, because in the meantime, certain customs had grown up and certain ways of doing things had grown up. And that is what had happened to the Licinian Law, which had never been popular with patricians anyway, because what that law said was everybody gets 500 acres, and whatever is left, we divide among those who have nothing, with some adjustment as to how much they get depending on how large their families are and how many dependents they have, and so on. So Tiberius Gracchi came back, and he was elected a tribune for the people. He was a plebeian, and he and his father-in-law and his brother pushed through this reinstatement of the Licinian Law, which was called the Sempronian Law, against great opposition from those 2,000 families that saw that their power would be whittled away if they lost some of their property. And they were given, the Gracchi were given the task of implementing this law that they had pushed through. And the patricians looked at it and said, well, this is never going to do. And so they started a rumor that Tiberius was trying to make himself king and that he was using the Sempronian Law as a way to gather support for himself so that he could make himself king. And as you know, the Romans were absolutely not going to accept a king again. So the patricians fomented a riot. And in the midst of that riot, Tiberius fled to the temple of Jupiter, and he put his hand up to his head, and immediately the shout went up, oh, he's saying that he wants the crown. and somebody in the melee struck him with a club and he died. And it's completely uncertain, and was uncertain at the time, whether that was intentional or not. But the power of the Gracchi family passed to his younger brother Caius, who still had this desire, and in fact had been given the job by the Senate of enforcing this law. He also was killed in a riot, along with several thousand citizens of Rome. And in fact, things were so bad that our old friend Scipio Africanus was called back from Africa and made dictator for a time in order to calm things down. And he was able to do that, but this law was never reinforced. There was peace for a little bit. Things kind of settled down, but the unrest was still underneath the surface. And then a war arose in Africa. If you remember from the last Punic War, the Numidians were a North African group who had supported the Romans against Carthage. But now they decided they didn't really want to share Roman rule, and so they revolted. And Marius, who was a under captain of Scipio Africanus, was sent, and was a brilliant general, was sent to put down that revolt, which he did very successfully. But he did something that would change the face of Rome. That he probably didn't intend to change the face of Rome, but he was being expedient, as generals often are. He recruited to his legions whoever wanted to join his legions, whether they were Roman citizens or not, whether they were criminals or not, whether they had any military experience or not, because he needed to flesh out the ranks of his legions. It was not an unreasonable thing to do. The Numidians had thousands of men that they could put into the field. And Marius said, well, I've got people that I can recruit right here in North Africa instead of waiting for troops to be sent from Italy, so I'm going to do it. But he didn't think about something. He didn't think about was that these new soldiers did not share Roman honor. For the most part, they did not share the idea of duty. And in particular, they did not hold the Roman state in high regard. And that would end up becoming an issue further down the road, until in the late empire, we actually see soldiers who are loyal to their generals, but not to the state, deciding that their general ought to be emperor. And we get these constant little revolts that happen until Rome finally falls apart. And that change from, I am a Roman soldier and I am a Roman citizen, and my job is to protect the state, to, I am a Roman soldier who is recruited to follow this particular general, and he pays us on time, he leads us to victory, whatever it was, makes a big difference. And it ends up really causing the city of Rome to be afraid of its own armies. So Marius was wildly successful. He was actually made consul. He was consul 6 times. And several of those times were because Rome was under direct threat from outside forces, because he no sooner is done with the Numidians than he's recalled to Rome, because these two tribes from Cisalpine Gaul and north of Cisalpine Gaul, you'll recognize the Germans right here, the groups that would become German, Teutonic, were threatening Rome. And the Cumbri actually were a tribe that was on the move with their wives and children and everything. And Marius, again, who was an expedient general, he let them go past him and then attacked them from the rear. And because they traveled with their wives and their little ones and everything, he basically wiped them out. And then, receiving a frantic message from the consul who was defending Rome, he came up to fight the Teutones, and the Teutons said to him, well, we want whatever you gave the Cumbri. And he said, well, the only thing I gave the Cumbri is on the other side of the Alps, i.e. they're all dead, and wiped them out as well. And he continued to be made consul over and over again. But his power kind of went to his head, and he started to do things without consulting the Senate. So I'm going to make so-and-so a client king and accept tribute from him. Now, the client king system was brilliant, where up until that time, the Persians and the Greeks and the Egyptians and everyone who had had an empire, Alexander the Great, they had treated conquered peoples as conquered peoples. The Romans said, no. we're going to make them do most of the work themselves. So all we have to do is defend the borders and the roads and collect taxes. And so they would take somebody who was of a high level in society, in the city-state or the country that they had conquered. And they would say, fine, now you are going to rule for us. So you keep that power that you want, and you keep those riches that you want. And your responsibility is to make sure that that the taxes are turned in. If you don't do it right, you have to pay us out of your own coffers. And to keep the peace. You're not allowed to put anybody to death, for the most part. That Romans kept that right to themselves. And you're responsible to answer to our governor. But you already speak the language, you already know the culture, you already have all the connections, you do the work, and we'll let you stay in power. And if you jump ahead to the birth of Christ, this is the position that Herod is in. He is a client king of the Romans, and he's responsible to Pontius Pilate with a certain amount of power, so he can have the baby. He has the babies killed, and it's kind of iffy whether that's really what he should be doing or not. So Marius set up some client kings, and the Senate and the rest of the ruling class in Rome looked at that and said, okay, so what is he doing? Is he trying to set up alliances for himself so he can take over? Because again, they're very worried that they're going to end up with kings and dictators again. So there's another man in Rome who's also very powerful, this gentleman, Sulla. And Sulla has bought into the decadence of Rome. In fact, he's described as having his rich lifestyle having made such a wreck of his body that he was fat and looked like a mulberry with blue eyes, which would be a reference to the fact that he drank so much that his face was all red and broken up. Well, Sulla thinks that Marius is getting too much power, so he starts raising riots, and he starts saying, we need to take Sulla down. And each of them has an army. They come into conflict. Marius, by this point, is old, and eventually he actually drowns. And Sulla is left in charge. Now, Sulla wants to make sure that there will not be anyone who will contest him. And so he puts together these lists called his prescriptions. And he's got an army, and he goes into the Senate, and he says, so these 80 people are the people who need to be put to death today. And the Senate's like, okay, fine, just those 80 people. Yeah, they really kind of were part of Marius's deal. And the next day, Sulla comes in and he says, so I got another 125. And anyone who shelters any of these people is put to death. And there's this sort of bloodbath in Rome and cleansing. And one of the things that happens in that time is that the family of Julius Caesar is affected. And Caesar actually is forced to flee Rome. His family is too powerful for them to execute him. But he is forced to flee Rome. And so we have this period from 88 BC to 71 BC, you probably can't see that, where there's this constant, nobody trusts anybody, and finally Sulla dies. And he is no longer part of the picture. And so things again kind of settle down. In the meantime, there's a brilliant general whom we think of as Pompey, who is trying to further Rome's interests outside of Rome, and in particular in North Africa. So if you think of your map, and so I've drawn it here before, I'll sort of gesture at the board, but if you think of your map, Italy is here with Cisalpine Gaul, France, we have Spain, then we have the Straits of Gibraltar in North Africa, with Carthage ending up like this. And of course, down here at the bottom would be Egypt, where most of the grain in the ancient world is coming from Egypt, and Palestine. And the Romans, and Pompey in particular, see this as long as we don't control this piece here, then we're going to constantly have trouble in North Africa, because if we come into North Africa to stamp out a rebellion, they can just go to Egypt and Palestine. So we really need to hold on to that as well. And so they invade, and we'll have a whole thing with Pompey and with Caesar, and they are sort of rival generals, and we have Pompey getting involved with the Egyptian royal family. And in the midst of this, in Rome, there's the Catiline conspiracy. And a group of people get together and they try to bring back some of the things that were being done under Sulla. And thankfully, the wife of one of them goes and tells Cicero, the great orator, about this, and Cicero alerts Pompey, and Pompey comes back and stamps out the Catiline conspiracy. But as you can see, this constant struggle and political unrest and who's going to lead and who's going to lead is tearing Rome apart. And then finally, we get the wars between Caesar and Pompey. So Caesar has made Gaul his province. He has an army. That army is loyal to him, it's loyal to Rome, but it's loyal to Caesar first. Pompey has made what we now think of as the Middle East his province, and he has his army, and he has Rome. He's had a triumph. He's very popular. Caesar feels like Pompey's getting too popular. Caesar comes marching back toward Rome. We get that, don't bring your army any closer than here, and Caesar crosses the Rubicon anyway. And eventually there's a battle between himself and Pompey is killed. And now the way is cleared for the first triumvirate, which we'll talk about next week. But I want to back up a little bit and think about why it was the Roman Republic was not going to survive once the amount of territory that they held got beyond a certain point. And a big piece of it has to do with the fact that they cannot figure out how to give the poor more say, so they have more people who are loyal to Rome, who are in the ruling class, who can continue to hold territories for Rome, so they're not depending, and to fight for Rome, so they're not depending on native soldiers, and they're not depending on people whose loyalty is split, shall we say. But it also has to do with the fact that in general, humankind, and we can learn a lot about humankind from the Romans, if people have power, they generally want more. So you don't find the patricians willingly giving up power to the plebeians. And we also have to think about, yes, I can write it here, you see it. So there's this question of power and who holds it. And there's also this question of laziness. I really think that that's part of what you have to look at. If you are a poor person in Rome and you're a citizen and you're getting your corn, and you have people who are trying to be magistrates and they're giving gladiatorial games and entertaining you and asking you to vote for them, food and entertainment are pretty strong what's the word I want? Incentives to people to do what they're asked to do, to vote for this particular person as a tribune or that particular person to be in Senate. And you've already got a system of patronage where people are expected to vote for whoever their patron is and whatever family they owe loyalty to. And there's some, under Marius and Sulla both, there's some finagling around with who gets to be a citizen, and we'll tell all these Italians, not Romans, but Italians, they can be citizens if they'll come live in the city of Rome, and people take them up on that offer because it looks like an easy life. And that's attractive. And so because the Roman Republic was founded on an idea of people always being their best selves and of people looking out for the needs of the state and the needs of their fellow citizens over their own needs, there's no system really in place for, we have two consuls, Pompey and Caesar, and they both are looking out for their own interests instead of the good of Rome, and putting it in terms of this would be better for Rome because this would be better for me, and justifying it. And there's no system for putting a check on someone who's gotten very powerful other than getting a dictator giving him an army, making him all powerful to destroy this threat, whatever it is, and then hoping that, like Cincinnatus, he'll give up his power when he's done and go back to his farm. And you get a lot of talk during this time period of, well, let's go back to the old ways. Let's go back to the old ways. I mean, that Licinian law was an attempt to go back to the old ways. But there's no reason for people who have gained power and who have gained riches. And remember, this whole time, plunder and tribute is coming into Rome, and Rome is the richest city in the world. There's no reason to give up any of that. And there's no reason for people to decide that they should give more loyalty to the state than they give to their own needs and their own families. And in part because one of the foundational ideas of Roman honor and duty had to do with honor and duty towards the family. There's a contradiction built in, and they don't really have any way to handle that. And that's the stage upon which Julius Caesar comes to power after having defeated Pompey, and upon which the two triumvirates, first and second, come to power, and eventually you end up with an empire because some kind of strong central leadership is needed. And the examples that they had were dictators, kings, emperors. And that was pretty much it. And they didn't know any other way to do it. And so that's what happened. I will post this on YouTube and in the Facebook group for Co-op, and also send out the quiz. Be sure to take some time when you're watching this and copy down this timeline, because it will help you keep people straight. And I will see you all on Monday.